Hello, Anthea Buys and Helena Chávez. I'm very, very happy to be here speaking from Mexico City in a conversation about what is happening with the art world in different perspectives and in different issues during this time of the pandemia and the lockdown we are suffering around the world. We are going to depart, in fact, from some of the arguments that Anthea just published a few days ago in Norsk, an article called "Scripted Engagement," where you describe your experience of somehow experiencing the online services, both of the commercial and non-commercial providers of art at the moment. Can you tell us a little bit about that? How was it that you got online to check fairs and also museum programs?
Yeah, well, I live in South Africa, and the feeling one can have living on this end of the world is of being quite peripheral to everything that's going on in the art centers, whether that's in Europe or in Asia, or in the various centers that exist. So I'm always quite attentive to moments that that maybe disrupt that kind of geographic placement. So when I'm not sure how exactly it was that I came across the Art Basel Hong Kong going online. I must have maybe read about it somewhere on, I don't know, in some news or on Facebook or something like that. But I was quite intrigued about what this online art fair could actually be, and if it would be something that's more interesting than a normal art fair. And in particular, what intrigued me about it is the possibility that this would make what is quite a private and elite, and in one respect inaccessible platform, more accessible to people all over the world, especially considering that for the duration of the online edition of the fair, it was possible to access the fair for free. So there wasn't that usual barrier to entry, which is the ticket price, never mind the travel and everything to get there. So that's kind of where my inquiry started. And in visiting the fair, I mean, it was quite a disappointing experience. The actual fair is essentially just like any online showroom. It's a way of publishing JPEGs of artworks. But that kind of got me thinking about what's at stake for different players in making their content available online. So there's obviously the pure commercially driven motivation of selling artworks and having committed to all of these galleries, or having taken their money to put on an art fair and then no longer having any product. So scrambling to try and create a product. But then on the other hand, there are these non-profit initiatives like Google Arts and Culture, which I spoke about quite a bit, which have different imperatives and different products, if you will. So anyway, my feeling is that no one comes off completely well in this. Compromises are made at every level. And what I find very interesting in this moment is to try and understand what those compromises are, who's expected to compromise, who has the power, and is any of that power redistributed?
Indeed, we are facing in the so-called art industry a sudden shift of ethos and practice. We were, even us that we live in the so-called periphery, we're very used to just be jumping on the plane to try to be part of these several networks. As you said, some of them have to do with the remaining pretensions of centrality of metropolis. Others have to do, on the contrary, with the decentering of the networks that actually keep people jumping from continents to one place to the other. Something I once jokingly tried to describe as the condition of the jet proletariat, because he's not necessarily the kind of James Bond jet set of experience of the past. It's actually hard work, sometimes against your health, and in a frantic, not necessarily dignified condition. But there's this drive that you had to be there, and all of a sudden we had the drive of publishing, of talking across the world, of putting something that would suggest that you're still alive, you know, on the web. I was quite amazed with your noticing that there's an appearing norm in these presentations. One very funny aspect that you caught immediately is that practically every gallery work presentation includes a bench, so as to give the buyer a scale, a sense of scale. I also thought so as to give the viewer a hypothetical place in the image, the site that you cannot occupy but that you are probably longing to reach. It's a little bit like a Caspar Friedrich painting, where you have the image of the void that you cannot see inserted in the image field. But one thing that nonetheless attracted me a lot of your first, let's call it expedition, because it's more than assessment. It's an online tour. Is the feeling that you have that this is actually going to stay? Of course, the market is opaque. I call it the plutocrat art market is particularly opaque. But some people have actually told me that surprisingly, people are buying in this form, either because they are idle rich people around, or because there's a feeling that speculating with money might be an option for at least some of their assets. But you seem to believe that this is actually the presentation of an experience that is going to grow, that is not only a fad, that is not only an emergency condition.
Sorry, I think that what's happening now is that we are realizing what's possible when we need to be online, when we need to transact online, when we need to have that online art experience in the absence of the possibility of traveling. We find that it's possible, and we find that we're okay with it. And maybe collectors who haven't spent a couple of $100,000 on a work they haven't seen, maybe they do it for the first time and they realize, oh, well, this isn't so bad, I could do this again. So there's a kind of creep where an increasingly kind of virtualized experience becomes normalized. And so I do think that, I do think that after this, after things have gone back to normal, whatever that looks like, I do think that we'll live online more than we had before. I think the simple fact that it saves people, maybe money is not such a thing for people to be concerned about, at least this kind of echelon of people, the jet proletariat, as you call them, but the inconvenience and the taxing nature of the travel, when we can somehow minimize that by not having to go everywhere, won't we take advantage of that and inhabit this kind of new virtualized art scene? I mean, that's my suspicion. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I was trained as a historian, and I believe that one important part of being trained as a historian, a proper historian, I mean a social, political historian, is that you're vaccinated almost every class against prophesizing, that you are constantly reminded of every ridicule that everybody did when they were trying to explain how the future was going to look like. We are more ready to to try to think on the possible differences than to actually project what could happen. But indeed, there's a trend in general where, as everybody knows, in emergency situations, temporary measures become permanent. So indeed, I have a feeling that we are also exploring certain possibilities, but also finding certain limits. Helena Chavez, that is a very close colleague, a philosopher, somebody I collaborate. Actually, we have a seminar together, and we had to transform the seminar into an online seminar and to event, and we decided, I think that quite rightly, to focus on what was happening, what we were all thinking, and to change the subject to make a seminar on the emergency and the question of that we were looking at, which was animism, and in the contemporary world became a question about the tensions between life and society. Helena has been very concerned and not only concerned but also occupied in trying to think exactly the opposite tension, more than just reacting against this transition. And she's a philosopher. Her job is always to try to stop us all to actually make a question, and the question has been, what is the relationship between this drive activity and the question of our commitment to reproductivity and to life. So I would like to, somehow ask her to discuss this same aspect, this mediated access, this drive to put things in the internet, all that. How do you think on it in relation to the experience of being confined and the physicality of this confinement, especially from a feminist perspective?
I mean, I guess what it worries me is that there is this kind of rush of normalize the situation in the art scene and in the academic scene, and there is this rush of deciding how the future is going to look, and doing so in the structure of isolation and being home. And I mean, of course, it's different, the conditions in Mexico than in South Africa. I know that lockdown in South Africa is way more strict than in Mexico. But in order to work or to keep working, for me, what is worrisome is that like the division between reproductive labor and productive labor, it's way more, it's going deeper and deeper, and it's going to, somehow it's more invisible than it was before. So somehow now, for example, for being able to be here, I had to go to my mother's house to leave my daughter, because otherwise I would have like a 3-year-old kid here running in a 80 meters apartment. So it's very hard that the conditions that we're submitting to the workers in the cultural field. I mean, I guess one of the fields that are going to be hitting the worst in this condition is going to be artists. I mean, like the precarity of their work, it was huge, and nowadays it's going to be even worse. So I'm just worrying that in this kind of trend of normalize culture and normalize some kind of rhythm, in doing so, we don't consider the particularities and the conditions in which we are producing today. I mean, I'm not against producing, but I'm against producing avoiding the tension that it is, that in order that I have a talk, I need to deal with my daughter, I need to clean my house first. So there's a lot of work that I have to do in top of my work. So I just like, I'm concerned that if we normalize this new rush and this new urgency of culture without assuming the conditions of the people that is producing that, it's going to be very hard on people, even harder. I mean, and even harder in women, and even harder alone mothers or mothers or elderlies. I mean, like, it's going to hit very, very hard to people. So I would like that maybe we can stop a little bit in the production of the cultural scene, and instead of going like in this kind of frenzy and this kind of rush of being the most visible museum and the most visible art fair, we could stop a little bit in thinking, so how now we produce in order to support our community as well? I mean, it's going to be really hard for artists. So what we are going to do to help them work in these conditions as well. So I guess that is my main preoccupation on this kind of rush that I can feel on productivity. And like, I don't know in South Africa, but in Mexico, all the museums has now a program online. There's like millions of Instagram lives going on at the same time. So today, I don't know, like I have one, but there are like 5 in my own network programmed at the same time. So there is this kind of rush of keeping culture alive. And like we were discussing yesterday with Cuauhtémoc for another reason for the program that we're going to teach next term, that so why we keep making culture, so why we believe that we should keep working on this. And I do believe that we need I need to figure it out why, but I guess that's what we're going to work next term. But I do believe that we need to work on that. But I guess that we need to consider also who is working in these conditions and how they are going to work and how we can help to each other and how we can ask just what people can do. I mean, like, it's very, very hard in these conditions to keep this kind of rush and urgency of being productive. And I don't know, I mean, I guess my lines of thinking are going that way.
And I guess that we also need to think and take into account an aspect that is still to be discussed is what is the balance between visibility and fermentation, if you want to call it that way. Because on the one hand, it's true that we are, when something that is substantial to our process, that people can look at it as merely superficial, but this is the fact. Our practice is with a social interaction with a huge number of different activities and conversations, with silent collaborations. So the moment of visibility is in reality the peak of these ways of living. And in this moment, we have a normalization in the worst sense of the specification of a single possible form of social interaction that happens to be also very different in relation to, first, is simplified. It has a few channels in some ways. It's also abstract and not, I mean, it pays, increases the cult to the universal screen, as Dr. once said, that everything is happening now in one single device and in one single artifact. But it is also a situation that is somehow reducing our experience, that makes also part of the sense of producing art. That is not only the object, is the social life, the communicability, the affection, the interaction around it. How I was wondering, to come back to Anthea, what is the situation of the artists in South Africa as you can perceive it? Is there a concern about what is coming to their lives? Is there a certain political activity? Is there a questioning?
I think artists in South Africa, as it is for artists everywhere, have a precarious existence. That the contemporary art space here is really shaped by commercial galleries. So there aren't really strong institutions. It's a culture that's developing, but it's really quite new for there to be contemporary art centers and museums. And actually one was just meant to open in Johannesburg in April, and they've had to defer their opening. So I think that artists are at the moment self-organizing and being very present on social media and visible on social media. But the presence of South African art at the moment is really being driven by commercial galleries through online platforms that they're developing. Yeah, I think because we haven't really had a very firmly embedded museum culture here. Our museums are sort of national museums and municipal museums are in a state and have been in a state of neglect for quite a long time. And so private institutions are just starting to step into that space. But we haven't really developed a culture around museums and around museum representation of the art scene. So I think, yeah, I think it's self-organization and extreme precarity at the moment for artists here.
And in that sense, I think it's going to be important and interesting to think very situated in the context. I mean, of course, the context of South Africa is completely different from the one in Mexico. I mean, as I've been working a lot with some South African artists, and it is very impressive that the whole dynamic of the art scene, it's so dependent from the galleries. So of course, then the whole situation is going to be different from here, in which galleries has an important role, but museums has another important role, and the state has a very important role that is changing and shifting and collapsing, if you want to say it like that as well. So I think it's very important to rethink how we are going to keep moving with these art scenes, because I mean, if the commercial part is the one that takes it all, again, so who are the artists that are going to be able to keep producing at the same speed? Are going to be male generally, and of course it's going to be harder on women, or more, or yeah, harder, and it's going to be way more harder for single mothers. So I keep thinking that we need to introduce some kind of conversation, and I think I understand what you're saying, Cuauhtémoc, about the peak of visibility, but maybe also the institution needs to deal better with the artist in a way. I mean, how institutions now are going to be able to make visible or generate incomes and different chains of survival, I guess, with artists, that it has been very precarious. I mean, our role in the museum, it's very, very complicated as well, in the sense that it doesn't produce money.
Situation here, I would like to present it as a very complex ecological system that indeed operated through the combination of different economies. One of the economies was a sub-economy of precarity that kept a certain sector that also was traversed by racism and by a certain notion of what was the establishment. But certainly, until now, there were a couple of elements that had to do with, on the one hand, a system of state grants that has now been put in peril by the government, along with significant institutional structure, most of it state-based, that was moving in a process of starting to produce a certain professional engagement with artists, in the sense of we are the first generation of institutions who's paying fees for artist participations on a systematic way. Very small fees that don't become significant in terms of the income of artists, but nonetheless, it was a moving into that direction. Now, the pandemia, but more than that, the way the Mexican government is addressing this issue on the basis of a philosophy of scarcity, where in the name of helping the poor, they're in reality applying neoliberal reforms that are going to constrain institutions and basically leave them bloodless. The current government is trying to get national institutions giving back 75% of their operating budgets in the next months. 75%.
Wow.
Along with the devastation that this is going to produce on the very small, let's put it this way, not private, but independent public sector that was growing, of independent institutions and some funding bodies that were were made by patrons. That all is going to actually make of a significant collapse, and the collapse will, that's something I'm clear, will produce a huge crisis in different sectors, but the creative sector is going to suffer particularly. This will have a political responsibility. Is what we are doing at the moment, as Helena knows, is yelling, going to the press, criticizing the way the government is handling the situation, fighting back. And there's an organization on the part of artists to react. The contemporary art world and the cinema world have been particularly active in voicing in these few weeks of the crisis the need of rethinking what the government is doing. I don't believe that under those conditions, and also a taxation system that systematically has avoided cultural responsibility, even in relation to having a tax system that doesn't tax legacies, which is an oddity in the world. It's a complete oddity that Mexican tax system doesn't charge the passing of assets, money, and artworks from one generation to the other. Anyway, that is going to basically, that's my view, not only disrupt, but in fact, destroy the structures that we have been growing around. Now, Helena's question is quite right. The problem is that which institutions are you talking about? The government is going to basically slash budgets. The university will need to defend its budgets. The patrons are not going to have an excess of monies. So your demand becomes, forgive me to put it this way, symbolical, because there's no structure to actually make that demand except the Mexican government. My concern, on top of that, is that in reality, even moving to that direction, and I can tell you that there is a real debate in the university, national university cultural structure about that topic. It's something we are trying to question. What can we do in that regard? Is something that may operate in the short term, but having a government that has not only cut budgets, but adheres to the view that the art sector is not really important, will produce something that is paradoxically the worst possible scenario, that cultural producing will become, by force of these structures, a bourgeois privilege. So I understand that Helena's question is the right question, but it's a question that will have nothing to stand on. Maybe because I'm still some sort of Marxist, I have very little appreciation for people's will, especially for goodwill. I understand that the problem is about structures, and yes, that's why the real concern I have at the moment is that of a political pressure, because the changes that are being imposed that's not predicting the future, that's just understanding consequences, have a clear outcome: the impoverishment of the structures that we had that were poor, the erosion of the market, and some artists actually live from that market, and the impoverishment of institutions that will not even be able to address the question that Helena is putting.
Can I say something?
Yes, yes, of course.
I think maybe one of the issues that we need to discuss at some point also will be the term of, or the idea of a scale, and the scale in which we were working before in this kind of, I think you described it before, not now, but in other situation as a traveling circus. So that we were like in this kind of huge scale, moving around and making projects from everywhere and super expensive and so on. I mean, like creating this kind of idea of globality and globalization, and museums were part of that, and culture was part of that. So maybe also we need to play with the scale. I mean, I'm not saying that we need to forget about the notion of the world and this idea of I'm playing with the scales, but maybe also we need to think in other forms of scale and producing more local and trying to make other forms of shows. So like, I know the narratives in the institutions was also trying to deal with this kind of international and like global narration of the art history, but maybe we need to change the scales as well. I mean, I know that you have there is an issue with how we are going to survive this crisis locally in terms of our president and our governmental decisions, but also maybe we need to start thinking, how was the scale working and how we might need to change that conversation as well. I mean, it's hard. Like, I was working with artists in South Africa and it's not going to happen anymore. I mean, it's going to be very, very hard to keep doing this kind of circulation that we were doing before. But I don't know, maybe we can find ways. And in that sense, I'm not against some kind of virtual or other forms of connection or cooperation or collaboration, but like, yeah, the way we were working, it's not going to, I mean, the big show that we have now in Bellas Artes, that it's like one of the most important museums in Mexico City. It's the biggest show on Modigliani, and it's in boxes, and no one is going to see it, probably. It was a massive show on Modigliani, and they expected thousands and thousands and thousands of people going to that exhibition. So maybe it's that scale that the one that is not going to work anymore. And moving these kind of works and the insurance that they cost, I mean, I think we need to make some shifts also. And this is also quite an opportunity to make some shifts.
Anthea, you want to go on that? Because I do, but I'd rather hear you first.
No, go ahead, go ahead.
This change of scale will occur. What worries me, actually, that's not the right way to put it. What I reject is that in a moment when the descaling will happen as a result of a force majeure, let's put it legally, because it's what we will need to do. We accompany that catastrophe with a moral halo. On the one hand, the description that you're doing is partial because there was a combination of those different scales happening in real life. And the same way I always find it completely unhealthy that the press translates cultural activity into headlines about auction prices and a concern on the big events, because it's a misrepresentation of the texture of the field. I feel that there's a level where it would be wrong to discuss this with a moralistic point of view. The scale was the scale of a system that was giving, particularly the art world, the contemporary art world, critical mass. I have never been against that because that critical mass had translated a minority subculture into something that was approaching becoming the general culture. And that, in my view, was something useful. So I feel that some of the criticism to that structure having entirely focused on the description of fire vanities, rather to in the thinking of the connection between even precarity, the demographies of the art world, which have become huge, and the opportunities that it provided to a certain heterogeneity. Certainly, people working as officials as I do, we had the possibility of making a choice of having a political engagement and a criticism around the type of institutions that we were creating or not. And that's something that has to do with the specific policies that could be criticized in each case. But yes, I find it very somehow strange to bring out the question of descaling as a virtue when it's going to be a tragedy. Now, putting that argument apart, I have an experience that has to do with the history of the Cuban group Los Carpinteros, which has just recently dissolved. But in 1991, when Los Carpinteros emerged, what they did was to defy the default aesthetic of precarity of Cuban and Latin American art by producing artworks that conceptually embedded in their value a notion, or at least aspiration of heaviness, quality, and craft, which was presented as a form of resistance, especially against the special period of the Cuban regime. So I am ready to say that in a moment when the situation will be sad, terrible, and precisely povera, to talk about the term invented by Germano Chelant that died today of coronavirus, and that embodies this paradox of the person that named Arte Povera and somebody that was working in a league that I don't pay attention to because I find just plutocratic. But somehow I don't think that is logical for the space of art that has always been engaged with paradoxes and defying norms to actually normalize misery. So my answer is the governments, the economy, and the self-flagellation of the cultural critics will do that. But I have a feeling that artists and art institutions will probably try to combine, defy, and work on a certain way out of that constraint. But maybe Andrea has a different view.
Well, just to touch on scale, you know, one tends to think of traveling Modigliani exhibitions and that kind of project as, I guess, as the culprit or the face of an kind of overindulgent and excessive art industry. But I mean, when you think about, for example, just to return to art fairs, the amount of money and shipping and materials and manpower that goes into putting up exhibitions, and sometimes quite spectacular, and is in the sense of spectacle, exhibitions that last for, you know, a long weekend essentially. I mean, I don't know if you've been to Art Basel Unlimited and seen, I mean, just the enormous scale of these installations, which are then taken down after 5 days. And, you know, one has to wonder if that kind of scale is really sustainable, or if it's even, I mean, if it's even really necessary. I suppose talking about what's necessary becomes problematic because, you know, people could say, is it really necessary to bring an exhibition of Modigliani paintings. But I think that what the point I'm trying to make is we're thinking in a museum scale and calling that into question, but there's another scale of operation in the arts industry that is just so much larger, and that is the scale of commercial exhibition making and spectacle. And to me, I think that can't go on unchecked, and that does need to be scrutinized. And I think that we do need to consider the ethics of that level of production. Yeah.
Helena.
Yeah, I agree with Anthea. I mean, I think that a lot of things need to be rethinked. I mean, of course, I'm not a I move way more in the institutions and the art scene that is produced in museums, and I don't follow fairs that much, so I'm not in control of that situation and how it works and how it moves. But like the inner logic that it was prevailing in Mexico, at least in Mexico City, was the number of people going to exhibitions. So that was the logic. And it was not about creating a mass of possible spectators or public or critical public. It was just about numbers. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to rethink also that logic. It's not going to be about numbers anymore. I mean, it will be interesting to check all the exhibitions in Mexico City, but like the last 5 years had been a little bit crazy in terms of that kind of blockbuster kind of panorama. I mean, Kusama, Leonardo da Vinci. We had that Leonardo da Vinci exhibition that it was not even a good exhibition. I mean, it was mostly bad work because it was impossible to bring it. Duchamp and Jeff Koons. I forgot the one at MOAC. Well, Ai Weiwei, but it didn't work in the same way. But I mean, that logic of numbers and I think it might need we need to rethink it. I mean, I think it's a problem also of scale, and I'm not thinking in terms of also ethical terms that maybe I should, but I'm not even going into that. But maybe just to think about ecology that we need to have nowadays in order to create this kind of narrations. And I was talking with someone for the Sao Paulo Biennial, and they were considering other forms to show some works that were now too impossible or too expensive to bring because the conditions of traveling. And it's also interesting I mean, what we do with this kind of narration and connections that we already have. And that is very interesting, that the trend of the history is not just one major river or flow between Europe and America, but now we have like lots of, let's say, small rivers. So what we do with that, maybe we can play, and we can play with other forms of showing works, and maybe we can make reproductions, and maybe we can do other stuff. I mean, I'm not against that people see Modigliani, but maybe it's not sustainable anymore to make a show about Modigliani to be on show. I mean, I don't know, it's going to be hard, and we need to be also creative. I know you need to fight the conditions that the state are creating, and not only because of institutions, but also because of the people that are working, that there are really in very, very bad conditions. I mean, I was watching or reading in Hyperallergic last night, and 90%, in between 60 and 90% of artists and art workers in America are losing their jobs. Mm. So it's insane what is going to happen at that level. So I also think that, I mean, I don't want to believe that crisis is an opportunity, but it changed the scenario. So we need to play, and we need to make creative forms of playing with this catastrophe. Otherwise, we are going to still thinking in the past as a way of work that work, and it didn't work as well for many. It worked for some, but not for many.
Yeah, but I again have a feeling that there's a certain element in what you're saying that is essentially leading the discussion to valuing that this becomes an elite structure that will have a few participants that has what I describe as the village nostalgia. I will probably want to go there to, I mean, basically I'm trying to say, I feel very worried of developing an argument that because of pointing out to the absurdity of structures that lack criticality and that are commercially driven, which is of course something that I am very happy to say it's my enemy, my cultural enemy. That does translate into criticizing the way in which contemporary art became something that is not a cliché project. And this structure will easily lead us, this situation and the claim that the less is more will lead us to a situation where we are going to have a happy few exchanging points around the fire. And I have the feeling that there's a certain moral intention of going there. And I don't think that's something I want in any case. It's very logical that in a 20 million people city, having an exhibition that has 100,000 visitors is not a huge event. I'm sorry, the scale is embedded in something that to reverse it will take a few hundred years if we decide to reverse it, which is that we have a concentration of demographies and we have a significant number of people that is probably also not sustainable. But I don't want to continue with my question of that. I want to go on another topic that you brought out, and is this. Surely one element that is haunting us is the claim that locality will become king. I have the feeling that until now, the more global the art structure was, the more possibilities for local arguments and localized politics were available. I disagree entirely with the dichotomy of those terms. Instead, I feel that nationalism and identity politics will immediately lead us to positions that will have political efficacy and that will actually reduce the scope of our politics and will lend the art world into other kind of cultural enemies, those that actually are alien to the debates that we want to have. But that's, I mean, my fear. I think that, on the contrary, that the rich, the wealthy, the commercial sector, the tourist machine will retain its global scale, and that in this, the prospect that we have is, on the contrary, to end up having a regression into nationalism. But maybe you.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're completely right, and we need to be very careful and be aware of the vocabulary we use. When I say that we need to maybe think more local, it doesn't imply any nationalism or just to work within our community, because that will make poorer our world, that's for sure. What I'm trying to say is also that there is or at least I think about sometimes about that there is a trend in the art world that in order to function in this kind of scalability, we try to exoticize, and we sometimes make we try that the work of art, it's kind of readable easily in any of the parts of this kind of big scale that it moves. So what I think it might be interesting now is to open this kind of specific narrations and to keep working with them and in this kind of polyphony, if you want. So of course I was thinking more in terms of what Donna Haraway was saying about different stories and different narrations and different forms of telling stories or appearing things. I mean, I don't think that it needs to be based on nationalism, because that is going to be even worse, but to think about the local as a specific sensitivity and a specific view. Like, I'm more interested in works that it's hard for me to understand, that very easily reading works, that sometimes when you go to the verse and that what it moves around is this kind of works that it's very easy to move in this kind of global or moving circus or traveling circus. So what I'm trying to say is that maybe this is a moment also to try to open these kind of holes for different sensitivities, different perspectives, different narrations, different ways of producing art. And of course, it's what people are doing. I mean, it's what you did with your Shanghai show. I mean, I have clear that there's a lot of critical institutions that they do that when they do an exhibition. I mean, they try to put different voices to create not even an argument, but to bring massive amount of stuff to create a kind of polyphony voice. But I think that we need to put also attention to that instead of claiming for this kind of homogeneous and easy production of art. That I think is what is going to be difficult nowadays, because what is easy is to see a beautiful painting. What do you want to do now is just watch a beautiful movie or go and visit a beautiful garden, as the one that you sent me the other day. I mean, like, I want to go to those gardens now. I mean, and just be in a beautiful space. But anyway, I mean, that is a beautiful work of art. But I don't know if I'm clear, but like, what I'm trying to think, it's not about in those terms of the local. Not,
I think,
sorry, Anthea.
no, go ahead, finish your thought.
No, that it's only that it's super important what you're saying, Cuauhtémoc, in terms that we cannot go to that kind of logic of nationalist art, or that what we need to protect now is our locality or our community, but how to bring our community with different perspectives in another kind of scale. I mean, that is what I'm trying to think nowadays, because what is going on and because the readings we have had this couple of months. But yeah, we'll go on to.
I agree with you. I think that perhaps instead of thinking about this dichotomy of kind of globalism and nationalism, there's another one that's perhaps a little bit more helpful in this condition, and that is thinking between the centralized and the decentralized. And although there are multiple centers in the art world, they function as centers. You know, there are definitely multiple centers and even more peripheries. And my hope is that through, not necessarily through a shift online, shifting is not what we should be doing, but by the addition of a strong online presence, we're creating stronger voices across, you know, decentralized locations or situations. So, and to me, this is actually it's a problem and an opportunity of publishing, right? So as people sort of broadcast their online programs and, you know, try to make these online presences, what they're really doing is publishing their content. And as they're publishing, more information is available online, right? It's quite a simple principle. And the more information that's available online, the more people are able to participate in a community of knowledge. I mean, obviously what we don't want is for the same kind of 5 institutions and galleries to be to be publishing. We hope that this this trend will be able to disperse into kind of smaller, more granular levels. But I think that there's an opportunity here for a different kind of spatial justice to begin to play out. But I think it's crucial that we see this not as a shift to online, but a development of something that supplements kind of physical, institutional, conversational life that exists in the art world.
Finally, I would like to ask the two of you to somehow maybe say something that has to do with what are you missing most of the experience of art. What is the thing that you're really frustrated about? I want to somehow end with that on happy end today, if you like.
I can't really think of something that I miss, because I mean, I may have mentioned earlier that I actually find that I'm having much more access to different platforms than I would have had before, internationally, at the moment. But I went to a Zoom opening a few weeks ago, which was a friend of mine, an artist here, was having an opening, and we did the opening on Zoom, and that was I found this such a sort of happy and uplifting experience. I mean, there was sort of 60-something people there. You get to see each little person who's there. It felt so much more attentive and interactive than a real life opening, where I'd maybe sort of speak to 3 people and not really notice anyone else who's there. But here you're very aware of who else is in the meeting with you. So yeah, I don't miss real life openings.
Helena?
For me, it's been kind of weird as well. I mean, like I've enjoyed not lots, I would say 3 works of art these days, but I really enjoy them. I mean, one of them is one of that you show at the MUAC room 10, Ana Gallardo piece. I really enjoy it, and I was like really engaged with that work because I was able to watch it and rewatch it and rewatch it, and I had some kind of intimacy as well. So that, and the video of the this designer of I'm not going to remember the name, Pete something, about gardening and doing these beautiful projects. So I've been able to see and watch some material that has been very, very, very interesting, because I haven't been able to read novels, or they are very dark, and somehow I haven't managed to get into that. But what I do miss is like I do miss work with my colleagues. I was programming an exhibition, and I do miss that work of creating and programming and that. And I do miss like some kind of moments that are canceled or gone. Like I was programming, also directing this summer school that it's postponed at least for a year. And I miss that. I mean, I miss the articulation or the imagining how it would work to bring people that I didn't know into conversation with certain people. And I miss those conversations, and I do miss that encounters that they were going to happen. And it's really hard to have those encounters in virtual or digital scenarios. Like working online for class, sometimes I have the feeling that we're talking about different things, that each one of us, we are so embedded in ourselves and our thoughts, but we are not listening very careful what the other is saying. And when you have this kind of very questionable notion also about the presence, or when you are there with another, there's more things that happen in an encounter, and I do miss that. And I think that it's going to be hard that, and as I see that that thing has postponed or canceled, that opportunity of meeting and discussing and encountering new worlds and encountering new possibilities of thinking, that is very sad for me.
I need to confess that for the first time in years, I'm dreaming. And that is something, it's a very bad sign. And I found myself a couple of times dreaming about special spaces like museums or churches. And I had not realized how much the feeling of being in a special space means a lot to me. In a sense that I don't mean this, I don't miss the street. I don't miss going to the markets. I don't miss that. But yeah, there's something about it's the most horrible reactionary thing, if you want. The temple feeling of museum rooms and that kind of shit is something I really, really, really keep on thinking a lot. I probably am corrupted. I belong to that world. It's disgusting. I thought I was going to be missing the planes because Helena knows how much I love to be locked in the plane reading, and nobody's calling, nobody's bothering. I don't need to interact with anybody. I can be thrown into a book and forget screens. But no, I keep on thinking on the idea of going to a place that sounds different. And that's something about the feeling of spaces, of the kind of these art places, that they sound different because they are sterile, they are out of life somehow. But it's been great to talk to you. I think it was a really, really substantial